Okay, trying a slightly different angle here. Let's start chapter 2. Things you learn from Christian history. All traditions have to start somewhere. Here is a list of a few words not mentioned in the Bible. Lent, purgatory, penance, heresy, Trinity, evangelical, fundamentalist, predestination, confirmation, church, Christmas, Advent, Easter, Madonna, Pope, Archbishop, Cardinal, transubstantiation, diocese, cathedral, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, ordination, monk, nun, abbot, mass. Oh, and Christianity. Just because they're not in the Bible doesn't make them wrong or unimportant. But it does mean that at some point in the history of the Church, they were new. Chapter 2. Marcion, Montanism, and monks. Very alliterative. Lions 1, Christians 0. Around AD 100, a letter was sent from the church in Rome to the church in Corinth. The Corinthian church had, not for the first time, fallen out spectacularly with its leaders, and replaced them with new ones. Clement, a church leader in Rome, wrote a letter urging them to rescind that decision. His argument was that by removing the officially ordained leaders, the Corinthians were breaking a direct line of authority, stretching back through the apostles to Jesus himself. In a rather dodgy piece of translation, he quotes a line from Isaiah, "I will establish their bishops in righteousness and their deacons in faith." This is the first mention of the idea of apostolic succession, the idea that Jesus had appointed the apostles, who had then appointed church leaders, who then appointed other church leaders, and so on and so on. Only this idea, says Clement, ensures that leaders carry on the true Orthodox teaching. It also shows that a leader in Rome was assumed, if only by himself, to have a say in matters hundreds of miles away in Greece. Somehow, although they were miles apart, they were part of the same organisation. Both the Christians in Corinth and those in Rome, not to mention others scattered around Syria, Palestine and Asia Minor, were the church. It was a leader from Antioch who put a name to this concept. His name was Ignatius of Antioch, circa 35 to 107, and in a letter he uses a particular word to describe this organisation. He calls it Katholikos, the Greek word for whole or universal, to refer to the church where Jesus is. The word isn't found anywhere in the Bible, but Ignatius clearly assumes that his readers were familiar with the term. He doesn't bother to explain it. This became the word Catholic, the term today still widely used in our creeds, generally much to the confusion of various churchgoers who confuse the term with Roman Catholic. Given the number of splits, schisms, excommunications, and general differences of opinion on virtually everything, when standing and saying the phrase in the creed, "We believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church," it has always rather struck me as a triumph of optimism. But this is where it starts, with leaders like Clement and Ignatius. Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch, and he wrote this letter and others while he was on death row, a very long death row. He was being taken from Antioch to Rome to be martyred. He was a dead man walking, and walking a very long way. He talked of his journey in terms of being thrown to wild beasts in the circus. "From Syria even to Rome, I fight with wild beasts by land and sea, by night and by day, being bound amidst 10 leopards, even a company of soldiers, who only grow worse when they are kindly treated." In one memorable phrase, he described himself as God's wheat, to be ground by the teeth of wild beasts, so that I may become the pure bread of Christ. But he was not going to the mill against his will. On the contrary, Ignatius saw martyrdom as the crowning point of his Christian life. Nor was he the first to make the journey. He says that others had preceded him in martyrdom, from Syria to Rome, for the glory of God. This was literally a farewell tour. Along the way, he had the opportunity to meet many church leaders from the districts through which he was taken, and he wrote several letters to other churches, which he sent out via a network of runners. We see in the letters of Ignatius a church whose separate groups were always writing letters to each other, sending visitors from one church to another, keeping touch. This is a man who would have loved email. Ignatius's letters show that the church now had a much more developed leadership structure. He urges Christians in one church to follow their bishops as Jesus Christ does the Father, and their elders as he would the apostles, and to revere the deacons as being the institutions of God, opposed to putting them in an institution, although with many of them that wouldn't have been a bad idea. For Ignatius, a Eucharist is now only proper if administered by a bishop. Baptisms are unlawful, he says, if they are not overseen by the bishop. The fact that Ignatius has to argue for this, though, shows clearly that other churches disagreed. But they were bishops rather than the bishop. Ignatius writes to Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, but he appears to be one of a collegiate group of bishops in the city, less like a CEO and more like a board of directors. And while Ignatius admires the high standards of doctrine held in Rome, he doesn't mention any single Roman leader, certainly not a single bishop of Rome. This was not some power trip. The authority of these people was important because it was the only way, as far as Ignatius was concerned, to ensure proper teaching. Ignatius addresses an idea called docetism that has crept into some church teaching. The term comes from the Greek word dokein, meaning to seem. Docetists claimed that Jesus was not a real man. He only seemed that way. What he really was a mystical spirit. The idea originates in Greek philosophy. Jews believed that since God was good, and since God had created the world, that the world was pretty good, at least in the beginning. But Plato, the Greek brain box, had suggested that matter and the body were intrinsically bad. More, that they were a secondary reality. There was a higher, purer reality, an ideal, of which this world was just a reflection. To Docetists, it was impossible that God should sweat and bleed and cry and urinate and do all that other stuff that normal bodies require. Divine beings don't do that kind of thing. They just waft around looking gorgeous. Ignatius utterly refuted this. Jesus could be touched, he said. He became flesh, a man who might be touched and handled in the body, and who in every kind of way suffered for our sakes. He was a real man and really God. Ignatius died around AD 108, killed by the wild animals in the games. According to tradition, his remains were carried back to Antioch by his companions and interred outside the city gates. That was real enough, all right.